I'm going to read Dharkar's poem because it sets the poem, I think, rather beautifully for Shakespeare and Milton. And then I'm going to read one of the Shakespeare poems and the Milton sonnet that I'm talking about. So this is The Trick. In a wasted time, it's only when I sleep that all my senses come awake. In the wake of you, let not the day break. Let me keep the scent, the weight, the bright of you. Take the countless hours and count them all night through till that time comes when you come to the door of dreams carrying oranges that cast a glow up in your face. Greedy for more than the gift of seeing you, I lean in to taste the color, kiss it off your offered mouth. For this I fall asleep in haste, willing to fall for the trick that tells the truth, that even your shade makes darkest absence bright, that shadows live wherever there is light. Shadows live wherever there is light. Remember that part? And your shade makes darkest absence bright. Now, here's the poem that Dharkar's poem is after, Shakespeare's Sonnet 43. When most I wink, then do mine eyes best see. For all the day they view things unrespected. But when I sleep, in dreams they look on thee, and darkly bright are bright in dark directed. Then thou, whose shadows doth make bright, how would thy shadows form happy show to the clear day, with thy much clearer light, when to unseeing eyes thy shade shines so? How would, I say, mine eyes be blessed made by looking on thee in the living day, when in dead night thy fair imperfect shade through heavy sleep on sightless eyes doth stay? All days are nights to see till I see thee, and nights bright days when dreams do show thee me. Now, today I want to really talk about this poem, Sonnet 43, together with one of Milton's sonnets. But it's worth mentioning three other Shakespeare sonnets that similarly examine sleep, dreams, love, and waking. And I added these to the handout for you to look over later. Sonnets 27, 61, and 87. Now, arguably, Milton is mindful of this entire cluster as he's writing mind, composing his later sonnets. It was while working on Milton's disability poetics recently that I realized that such a poetics, disability poetics, that is, by the blind John Milton, actively incorporates his memoried reconstructions, reverberations, and syntheses of his cited and past readings, such as of Shakespeare, and especially of Shakespeare's sonnet treatments of love, sleep, dreams, and waking. And what might I mean by disability poetics? In discussing this concept, disability poetics, in the Oxford Handbook of Modern and Contemporary American Poetry from 2012, Michael Davidson writes, perhaps the closest link between poetry and disability lies in a conundrum within the genre itself, that poetry makes language visible by making language strange. Davidson's analogy is that the presumed normalcy of what it means to be human is similarly made strange by the encounter of a non-traditional body with an ideology of able-bodiedness. Now, I'm of course saying that Milton, first of all, has a disability poetics. That is, he has a critical understanding of how poetry is constituted by and within conditions and ideas of embodiment. And I'm also saying that we need to attend to Milton's disability poetics if we are to fully understand his last poems, Began Small. In this paper, I want to talk about Can you hear me? Everything has disappeared on me. Absolutely everything.
We can hear you.
You can hear me. I can't hear or see you, or well, I can hear you, so I must be able to see you. Okay, here you are. Well, that's good. I'm really I think my work is trying to update my computer. Obviously, this is just the time to do it. If this happens again, I'll try to log in through another computer, but I'm hoping to stay on. I'm asking it to hold off. In the paper today, I want to talk about a carrying over of Shakespeare's sonnets into Miltonic blind language, especially Milton's use of his memoried reading towards the making of one of his sonnets, explicitly combining his blindness and his poetic language, which is Sonnet 19 to his late espoused saint. Incidentally, I think there is another cluster. I won't talk about this today, but I think there is another cluster that Milton uses for his other famous sonnet, explicitly combining blindness and poetic language, his sonnet on his blindness, which shares an opening with Shakespeare's Sonnet 15, When I Consider, and moves through a different kind of meditation on time, transience, loss, responsibility, and the power of poetry. And Sonnet 15, by the way, it's that first poem in that a series of procreation sonnets to bring the poet into the equation and assert the staying power of poetry. And it ends, I'm just going to cite a couple of lines. And all in war with time for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new. Is a kind of, they also serve who only stand and write. Moving on to Milton's Sonnet 19, which in the Trinity College manuscript is Sonnet 23. And that's on your handout. I'm going to read it. Thought I saw my late espoused saint brought to me like Alcestis from the grave, whom Jove's great son to her glad husband gave, rescued from death by force, though pale and faint. Mine as whom, washed from spot of childbed taint, purification in the old law did save, and such as yet once more I trust to have full sight of her in heaven without restraint, came vested all in white, pure as her mind. Her face was veiled, yet to my fancied sight, love, sweetness, goodness in her person shined, so clear as in no face with more delight. But oh, as to embrace me she inclined, I waked, she fled, and day brought back my night. Something about this sonnet's emotional pitch and achievement seems to have resisted sustained critical engagement with the poem, or perhaps the very dreamlike nature of its topic has proved hard for scholars to materially grapple with. Indeed, the most robust arguments surrounding this sonnet have been about the identity of the person who is the poem's subject. Some critics have proposed that the subject of the poem is Milton's second wife, Catherine Woodcock, his late or recently espoused wife, whose face had always been veiled to him, for they had married in 1656 after Milton went blind, and whose name from the Greek katharos, pure, may have inspired the phrase pure as her mind. Others have proposed his first wife, Mary Powell, who died in childbed and whom Milton had seen in his sighted days, and may therefore yet once more trust to have full sight of in heaven. So the date of the poem's composition as well is mainly determined by the evidence of the hand of the scribe who copied the poem into the Trinity manuscript. And the hand is by one Jeremy Pickard, who came to serve as Milton's amanuensis after 1655. But to me, something about the poem's refusal to name his partner, this late espoused saint, actually enriches the poem. Whatever is lost through the uncertainty of the identity of the person, I think, is gained and more through the critical and moving power of the interpersonal tenderness signaled by the refusal to name her. What concerns me is the poet's discussion of his unusual vision and the poem's deeply ambivalent narration of blindness. And I want to lay out for you the profoundly disconsolate yet unambiguous creative power of his visual affliction for Milton, and pay attention to his borrowings from Shakespeare's metaphorical to his own literal, for the power of, to use Shakespeare's words, these unseeing eyes and sightless eyes. And I want to similarly show you Milton's comprehension and even assertion of sight as a sense that transcends the eyes, a kind of full body vision, full body radiance that I suggest is part of Milton's theorization of disability long before there is disability theory. And in this, I'm not attributing to Shakespeare any such theorization of disability. That understanding of where the metaphorical meets the material is, I think, Milton's own. But something about Milton's memoried reading, and today we're paying attention particularly to his reading of Shakespeare's sonnets, I'd suggest gave Milton a lexicon for discussing the ways and byways of his blindness. Finally, I want to point to and evaluate Milton's use of poetry to break and hold his dreams, perhaps another carryover from the Shakespearean sensibility. When most I wink, then do mine eyes best see. This could be Milton answering his critics in his Defensio Secunda, arguing his, that is to say, Milton's own insight. The image is worth keeping in mind for its profound inversion, one that Milton will use for his moral and spiritual high ground by the time he's being attacked for his physical, visual affliction. He goes blind, completely blind in 1652, and the second defense is published in 1654. And this little bit is also in your handout. If people need the handout again, here you are. This is in the handout. Finally, as to my blindness, I would rather have mine. And Milton is addressing his critics, your blindness, deeply implanted in the inmost faculties, obscures the mind, so that you may see nothing whole or real. Mine, my blindness, that is, Milton's, which you make a reproach, merely deprives things of color and superficial appearance. What is true and essential in them is not lost to my intellectual vision. Nor do I feel pain at being classed with the blind, the afflicted, the suffering, and the weak, although you hold this to be wretched, since there is hope that in this way I may approach more closely the mercy and protection of the Father Almighty. There is a certain road which leads through weakness, as the apostle teaches, to the greatest strength. May I be entirely helpless, provided that in my weakness there may arise all the more powerfully this immortal and more perfect strength, provided that in my shadows the light of the divine countenance may shine forth all the more clearly. For then I shall be at once the weakest and the strongest, at the same time blind and most keen in vision. By this infirmity may I be perfected, by this completed. So in this darkness may I be clothed in light. Milton's poem too begins and ends with the poet's blindness. There is such an ownership of the non-visual condition at the heart of the poem that the poet repeatedly refers to it. Methought he saw something, he says, deliberately skirting actual sight. What or whom he sees is somehow also veiled to him. Yet once more, at some point in some future, he trusts to have full sight he sees, thus indicating that full sight is not his normal condition right now. He has but a fancied sight, even at his acutest perceptive moment in the poem. And finally, he wakes to have day bring back his night. But when I sleep in dreams, they look on thee, and darkly bright are bright in dark directed. What is striking is that none of Milton's mentions of the absence of regular visual facility is either straightforward joy or simple grief. Instead, delight and sorrow are complexly intertwined in the poet's awareness that the intensity of the vision is enabled by his reality of blindness. The dream vision is particularly remarkable for the poet precisely because of vision's unattainability outside dreams. What or whom the poet sees in the dream is celebrated because she is in the poet's life doubly absent. The poet cannot see her because she is dead, and the poet cannot see her because he cannot see. He may never have seen her, or he may have seen her, but in his developing blindness, felt the loss of her visual presence even when she was around. An intricate wistfulness thus saturates several layers of consciousness until the poet gives it expression, leaving accessible the multiple layers of uncertainty and desire. First, his late espoused saint is brought to me like Alcestis from the grave, or by whom, and rescued from death by force, whose force? Yet she alone and by her own agency, presumably, came vested all in white and inclined to embrace the poet, her late husband. Second, she came as one whom washed from spot of childbed taint, purification in the old law did say. Her actual purification and post-mortal state of redemption by the old law is thus cast into questioning by the very mention of the one husband's dream of such salvation for his wife. Third, her face was veiled, yet apparent in it and in the rest of her person were love, sweetness, goodness, all these so clear as in no face with more delight. Within the incoherent coherence of the dream, these are not contradictions, but certitudes and aspirations that the dreamer must nevertheless awake and depart from. Subsequently, in the post-dream wakefulness of the poet, these ostensible paradoxes will be owned and inscribed to extend by what is by then already memory. How would, I say, mine eyes be blessed made by looking on thee in the living day, when in dead night thy fair imperfect shade through heavy sleep on sightless eyes doth stay. And these are some very deep longings. In the invocation of Book Paradise Lost, Milton will again write this out expressly. Thus with the year seasons return, but not to me returns day, or the sweet approach of even or morn, or sight of vernal bloom, or summer's rose, or flocks, or herds, or human face divine. In Milton's sonnet, sight and the beloved exist together, appear and leave together, and what the dreamer awakes to becomes poetry. By the time Milton composes the sonnet, he is dreaming while awake, dreaming of night and dreaming of both his last light of the past and his last and final light of the future. And looking to the future, this yet once more that the poet gestures towards, the sonnet records a trust and hope, even while it announces that the vision of the heart of it is almost a premonition. As he has had in his dream, there will come a time when he will have full sight in heaven without restraint, as though the fullest of mortal sight was and remains restrained. As in the dream, so in heaven ultimately, love, sweetness, and goodness will be readily apparent, even through the veiled face of a composite figure of affection, notwithstanding the subject's vision or lack thereof. And just as qualities of goodness will shine through her person, all her person, so too will the apprehension of those qualities belong to a holistic regard and perceptive faculty that draws from, yet operates beyond, a simple visual register. The love, sweetness, and goodness will be felt as much as seen, and sight will exceed the function of the eyes. Now, Milton's final couplet, it's not really a couplet, although it behaves like one, is the culmination of a movement throughout this poem from what can be seen to what cannot, a translation of what may be obtainable in vision to what may not. Liminal though she is, Alcestis, pale and faint, and brought to Admetus by Hercules, is intensely, eerily, visually available. The flushed and visceral sadness of a childbed death is chillingly associable with sight, And indeed, the image of the childbirth almost overpowers the spiritual idea of purification that is evoked immediately afterwards. So too is a woman in white, even with her veiled face, amenable to vision. But then we have love, sweetness, goodness, and delight. And here the images end, allowing memory and associative power of poetry to take over. A specialized or fancied sight becomes explicitly a matter of amalgamated sense, emanating from and available to a composite sensibility. This is the climax of the dream, and here language too might have stopped with the dreamer's contentment, allowing the dreamer his embrace, the desired fulfillment of the dream, the togetherness where language is no longer necessary. But such a culmination is not to be, and this moment of greatest positive sensibility is also the moment cueing the start of the dreamer's awakening. Milton records the instant where, alongside the poet's waking consciousness, language must similarly return to carry the weight of wakefulness and its attendant longing. But oh, as to embrace me she inclined, I waked, she fled, and day brought back my night. Shakespeare's final couplet in Sonnet 43 is a couplet. All days are nights to see till I see thee, and nights bright days when dreams do show thee me. And I want to end by simply calling attention to that peculiar reciprocity in that final line. Day brings back the night till I see thee, but nights are bright days when dreams show thee me. Who is being shown to who? Who is seeing? Who is being seen? What does that sight mean to the author of the poem or to the beloved? And what is sight if not the ability to perceive oneself regarded and able to return regard? And this later becomes Milton Sampson's great lament, that man who sits there with his palms full of sunlight, unable to look back where he is looked at. For Milton, the dream vision's ability to show thee me, interchangeably with show me thee, remains a matter both of longing and of poetic composition. And all that remains for the poet in Milton's poem is to take the memory and the blindness and the longing and render it as poetry. I think I'm going to end there. And I could leave you with one more link. This is Benjamin Britten's rendition of Shakespeare's Sonnet 43, another composition that I think taps into the blind energy of that poetry. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amrita. Jyotsna. Jyotsna, we can't hear you yet.
All right. Hello. Thank you so very much, all of you. It's so nice to see the names of so many friends here. And I'd like to thank Hannah and Lizzie so much for inviting me for the series. And I really applaud you for championing poetry. I was talking to them, you know, we need more poets in the world and less politicians, as we all must feel. So this is wonderful. And and thank you, Amrita, for a wonderful paper. I loved your concept of uncertainty and desire, and I think some of it I may be moving along. My paper is a bit of a outlier and experiment. I wanted to introduce you all to a poet I think is as great as Shakespeare, Fez Ahmed Fez. Circa 1911, 1984, and I'll talk more about him. And I'm trying to bring him into conversation with Shakespeare's poem. So I'll start with the screen share with the PowerPoint. Can I do that, Lizzie?
Yes, you should be able to.
Okay. All right, so I'm just going to read these poems. And the questions I want to raise today is, let me just play from the start, is How do we read and teach Shakespeare's sonnets? How do we respond to the lyric voice of the speaker that emerges in its breathtaking multiplicity of engagements with the two somewhat elusive addressees, the young man and the dark lady? And so this is a question, we all in our teaching and in our research, in our writing, we always engage with. And I want to kind of move beyond that also, is what discussions can we have about the meaning, nature, the very possibility of lyric verse in our own calls for social change and racial and sexual justice? And how may the lyric voice or voices be harnessed to exploring how individuals explore and inhabit a shifting world? So I'll start with this poem by Fez, which was written circa in the early 60s. It's one of his earlier work. And this is a poem that has swept pan-South Asia. It's a poem that everyone knows. And it's a meta-poetic poem that is really engaging with the central question is, what is the role of lyric poetry in a world that has suffering and pain? And how do we reconcile that? And I have to say that Urdu is like the most amazing language. It's a sort of composite of Hindi and Persian. And so in English, there's always a loss. The title in Urdu is Mujhse Pehli Si Mohabbat Mere Mehboob Na Maang. So you can just get the feel of the sound. So I'll just read the poem. That which then was ours, my love, don't ask me for that love again. The world then was gold, burnished with light, and only because of you. That's what I had believed. How could one weep for sorrows other than yours? What could one have any sorrow but the one you gave? So what were these protests, these rumors of injustice? A glimpse of your face was evidence of springtime. The sky, wherever I looked, was nothing but your eyes. If you'd fall into my arms, fate would be helpless. All this I thought, all this I believed, but there were other sorrows, comforts other than love. And then he goes on, the rich had cast their spell on history, dark centuries had been embroidered on brocades and silks, bitter threads began to unravel before me as I went into alleys and in open markets, saw bodies plastered with ash, bathed in blood. I saw them sold and bought again and again. This too deserves attention. I can't help but look back when I return from the alleys. What can one do, or what can I do? And you are still so ravishing. What can I do? There are sorrows in this world. There are other sorrows in this world, comforts other than love. Don't ask me, my love, for that love again. And now I'll read the Shakespeare sonnet, which some critics have called the Slavery Sonnet, and he uses the word slave twice and servant. This is sonnet 57. Being your slave, what should I do but tend upon the hours and times of your desire? I have no precious time at all to spend, nor services to do till you require. Nor dare I chide the world without end hour, whilst I, my sovereign, watch the clock for you, nor think the bitterness of absence sour when you have bid your servant once adieu. Nor dare I question with my jealous thought where you may be or your affairs suppose, but like a sad slave, stay and think of naught, save where you are, how happy you make those. So true a fool is love that in your will, though you do anything, he thinks not ill. So I will stop the share here. And now I would like to, read my paper for you, and we can refer back to the sonnets. So I just sort of repeat the questions is, how do we respond to the lyric voice of the speaker, in Shakespeare's sonnets? And these poems, the two poems I have read, are about love or / desire and its discontents. Now, Shakespeare's sonnets are often, and by some critics, seen as enclosed psychic spaces where the persona or the speaking voice is central. Helen Wendler, who is such a great critic, I think her view is that the sonnets show the performance of the mind in solitary speech. I want to sort of push at Wendler's formulation a bit, and, refer to so much wonderful criticism that has looked at sonnet, especially on the Dark Lady, in terms of race and in terms of, queering desire and so many other issues that are sort of beyond the solitary speech model. I want to explore how sonnets may lead us to think why plural, even a Janus-faced perspective, and raise questions about the lyric voice in the poem and the role of the lyric poet in the world. And so the questions I raise is, what can we discuss about the nature, meaning, and the very possibility of lyric verse in our times? And here my analysis will partly be informed by Aisha Ramachandran's formulations of lyric thinking, which I believe afford a generative new approach to the production and dissemination of early modern poetry. And I'm citing from her afterword called Lyric Poetics for the Global Renaissance in my collection that Hannah just mentioned, A Companion to the Global Renaissance. And Aisha informed me she couldn't be here today, but this is a sort of conversation we've had before especially about Fez's poetry. And some of you may not know that the film Heather, which was based on Hamlet, is really structured around a poem by Fez. It's something that I have written on, I'm just giving a plug for, is chapter 7 of my book, Shakespeare and Postcolonial Theory, where I've talked about Fez and Shakespeare. So Aisha's, I think her view of lyric thinking is really a very, very helpful to me, and I hope to others, to kind of come back to poetry and talk about poetry in sort of more centrally to the world we live in, rather than peripherally and looking at more at plays and other things. So how she describes it, the lyric thinking, is a unique conjunction of particular and universalizing modes of thinking in the lyric, which enables the lyric to articulate a phenomenology of worldly experience, how individuals explore and inhabit a shifting world. To think with the lyric, Ramachandran argues, through the lyric into the experience of world making, its phenomenology of process becomes an alternate means of exploring and expressing the global and the political, with a new focus on who speaks and how they speak, which voices get heard and how they get heard in the world. So I want you to keep these questions in mind, is how individuals explore and inhabit a shifting world. So in Fez's poem, you saw the speaker was trying to engage with the world of so much human suffering, as well as his desire and his love for the beautiful beloved. And similarly, in Shakespeare's sonnet is the sort of feeling of enslavement, of having no agency in the experiences of desire. And of course, the idea is, to always follow who gets to speak and how they speak. And this is something I find very useful in teaching the sonnets. And I want to argue, and this is something that I'm reaching out more and more in my new work, or in my recent work, is how lyric thinking, or even literature in general, but especially lyric thinking, enables students and readers and scholars to develop an ethical and empathetic imagination. This imagination should enable us to experience a sort of phenomenology of the lived experience. And the key is not to flatten this phenomenology of experience evoked in a poem or in a lyric poem specifically, into ideological agendas. So just to repeat, so as to not flatten the phenomenology of experience evoked in a lyric into ideological agendas, but at the same time, to ask, what is the role of the lyric poet and poetry in the world? And how do we engage with the social world in the poems? And how can these voices be harnessed about to explore this individual phenomenology? So both Fez and Shakespeare, as I will attempt to show, raise these questions in their poetry, explicitly and implicitly. In the sonnet sequences and in Fez's, in this lyric poem and in his other poems, a common theme is love and its discontents. And I think both poets have most intense poetic accomplishments as they examine subjective states of their speakers and personas created with them. So they're both examining formations of subjectivity and struggles, and, as the term that Amrita mentioned, sort of uncertainties of desire and the kind of contingencies of desire. So who was Fez? He was born in 1911 and died in 1984. And he was, born in the now Pakistani city of Sialkot. But I think what is remarkable about Fez that we should all learn from is the kind of education he received that was becoming at that time increasingly typical for young men of his upper class regional religions and class background. So his education consisted of rudiments of Quranic instruction, Persian and Arabic with the local, preacher, and yet modern colonial schooling, in this case with missionaries, and advanced degrees in both English literature and Arabic literature. He has written about and had widely read Shakespeare, Tolstoy, and other Western classics. He also worked in the British Army, and in post-colonial Pakistan, he was an activist who was imprisoned for his political activities. So he brings to his poetry this rich wealth of educational experience and personal engagement. He was very clearly a left-wing. He was a part of the progressive movement. He was a member of the Communist Party, and he lived in Beirut. And I think tragically, that is why he was never given the Nobel Prize. But even today, his popularity and iconic status in pan-South Asian communities beyond the boundaries of the national, communal, and the partition divisions. Amir Mufti is a very important critic who has written about Fez, in case you're interested. And so what he says, and I just got some few elements of Fez's poetry. One is that the poem I read for you is called a nazm, which is a more looser form of a sort of non-narrative lyric. But many of the poems that he wrote were called ghazals, which are almost as structured as sonnets. They are written in couplets with a very clear structural form. So, but on the other hand, his poetry overall was marked by two things. It was intensely personal in its contemplation of love and intensely sensuous. And yet, while he was examining these subjective states, he was also hoping to direct the poetry to radical political ends. So he was not unlike Shakespeare in that he turns traditional poetic vocabulary, like Shakespeare engaged with the Petrarchan conventions, to radical political ends. And often people, I think, read his poems more allegorically than they need to be read. And I think what I would like to stress in, especially in the poem I read and all his poems, that he stages these aesthetic dilemmas about the role of the lyric and about love and its discontents, but he never gives up on the sensory and sensuous, even while he's, in a sense, questioning the role of romantic poetry. I think that is what I feel rings with him and with Shakespeare. So this poem, and I'll just quickly briefly talk about this poem, Mujhse pehli si mohabbat mere mehboob na maan. Here we find the poetic persona is torn between the exquisite demands of unrequited love on the one hand, and those of the larger world and its oppressions on the other. These poems were turning points, as Fez has described, as he was growing dissatisfied with the dominant romantic literary ethos of the times. Thus, in the latter poem, the dominant mood is set by the speakers asking the beloved not to ask of the love formerly given, pehli si mohabbat. And this is a singular love that is alert to nothing but the beloved's charms and cruelties. So what Fez is saying is, how can there be only a singular love in the world when there are so many oppressions around us? Yet he lists the efficacies of this love, in which he had formerly believed, and wants to still believe. But on the other hand, the beloved must compete for the lover's attention with the injustice, equality, and alienation of the world. I think Fez also has resemblance to Donne in a certain speaking voice. There's a kind of immediacy of dramatic utterance. So very much like Donne's, for God's sake, hold your tongue. It's that kind of direct, colloquial speaking voice. But he's also, I think, very close to Shakespeare in questioning and interrogating the kind of romantic, poetic, rhetorical, very highly stylized Urdu poetry that had come from Persian poetry at the time, and kind of turning it on its head. So the Urdu ghazal that I mentioned, in which he often writes, has very strict metrical structures and histories of composition and certain kinds of thematic conventions and very Persian vocabulary. Fez keeps all of that and kind of turns it to interrogate it. So how do we compare it with Shakespeare? And this is where, I'm not doing a kind of strict comparison. What I'm trying to do is just generate a conversation here. So the comparison is Fez's poetry, I would argue, resonates with Shakespeare's sonnets and poetic vision. And how does it do that? And I want to go to a very good critic of sonnets whose work I greatly admire is Michael Schoenfeld. And in his introduction to Blackwell's A Companion to Shakespeare Sonnets, I think he gives some important sort of definitions. And of course, we know that, there have been such amazing critics and readers of the sonnets like Stephen Booth, Catherine Duncan Jones, Stanley Wells, Hannah Crawford. And I think there's been such amazing work done on the sonnets that have led us into this complex journey into the states of subjectivity and emotions that the sonnets produce. And I want to just continue in a journey and kind of bring another poet into the conversation. So here are some definitions of the sonnet sequence and what they do and how we can do a comparative analysis. According to Mike Schoenfeld in his introduction, quote, the sonnet sequence as a whole is haunted by the related phenomena of death and change. The poems struggle to find a satisfying answer to the question of what might abide in a world where only constant is change. What are the deep tensions and heightened drama they evoke? Then again, he goes on to say, the capacity of these remarkable poems is to embody complex emotional states to formally accomplish language. And I think this is where Fez and Shakespeare have much in common, to embody these very complex emotional states in very, very formally accomplished language. And both of them repudiate traditional paradigms. Both of the sonnets and Shakespeare clearly refutes the traditional paradigms, both of the sonnets and of romantic love. And, there's so many work done on Shakespearean sonnets and the Petrarchan sonnets. And so while Shakespeare repudiates those, he also changes and questions the taut formal structures and loose formal configurations to explore the ethical implications of aesthetic and erotic effects. So just to repeat that Shakespeare's sonnets repudiate traditional paradigms, both of the sonnets and of romantic love, their taut formal structures, loose formal configurations, while exploring the ethical implications of aesthetic and erotic effects or affects, unquote. So what I'm trying to say is, again, coming back to the line in Fez is, there are comforts, there are sorrows and comforts other than love. And so here you can find in sonnet after sonnet, Shakespeare is also, I believe, struggling with dealing with both the sorrows and looking for, and often and mostly, I think, finding little comfort in the pursuit of erotic desire and love. And as I mentioned before, I think the issue is, to what extent is the Shakespearean sonnet, the Shakespearean lyric, a genre that, as Helen Bender says, directs its mimesis towards the performance of the mind in solitary speech? How does it eschew the social and the worldly? And I think that this is a question that a lot of criticism on the sonnets, I think, has dealt with. And here is what I hope that maybe a conversation with Fez will lead us to think further on it. So sonnet 57, which Wendler called the Slavery Sonnet, which I thought was interesting, although she didn't address the term slave particularly. And this is her essay in this volume, Blackwell Companion to Shakespeare's Sonnets. And she, and we can see that it's not that slaves and slavery were not mentioned in other sonnets. For instance, sonnet 58 itself, which is another very remarkable sonnet, which if in a longer paper I could have time to write on, where he says that God forbid that God forbid, that made me first your slave. So in this sonnet, what is happening in Sonnet 57? The speaker or the persona casts himself a slave in not simply a supplicant pleading, but clearly a slave tending to the desires of his addressee, to kind of pointing to the limits of his agency. This is also a sonnet of the enslavement of the speaker, the single person who acknowledges to being, and according to Catherine Duncan Jones, I quote, being wholly subservient physically and mentally to his young friend, unquote. So it's a kind of singular enslavement. It doesn't refer to slavery or in any general or institutional condition. The addressee is also called the sovereign, the center of power. And here again, critics have noted a link between Sonnet 33. And so this sonnet develops the earlier imagery of the sun being the center of the universe for the speaker. So articulating his servitude, the speaker expresses a convoluted comfort, on one hand, evoking the bitterness of absence of his enslaving beloved. But he says he does not want to allow that absence to sour him once the former had bid his servant once adieu. So there's a kind of really interested reaching out to kind of scraps of comfort and trying to sort of pass his time waiting in his enslavement while struggling to keep some hopes alive. And so can the word be slave simply be a kind of innocuous term here? A metaphor for the speaker's emotional state of helplessness at the whim of his young man's desires and demands. Or can we also consider the speaker being, quote, a slave of his own desires, a construction of his own jealousy about the addressee? So there's a kind of interesting slipperiness is about the terms, the workings of the enslavement. I mean, he's clearly stressing the enslavement, a sense that he does not have any leeway, he does not have any scope. He is under the control of the desires of the young man. But I think coming back to what I had mentioned about the theory of lyric thinking and the phenomenology of the lived experience, I think it's worthwhile to consider that this sonnet, Sonnet 57, also reminds us that it is the enslaved who has the speaking voice here. It is the enslaved who is speaking, the person who identifies himself as the slave, who identifies himself as the sad slave. And again, quoting Helen Wendler, she describes this poem, though not much in detail, as a kind of shadow poem. And a shadow poem is one where she says, where one can, quote, deduce from the speaker's actual statement what he would really like to say to the young man if he could clearly speak. And she gives examples of other shadow poems too. So I'll just repeat, a shadow poem is where one can deduce from the speaker's actual statement what he would really like to say to the young man if he could speak clearly. And I would agree with her in that he passes a sort of implicit judgment when he says, what your affair may be. The word affairs apparently had its more sexual connotations in the 18th century, but here also, while it may not be explicitly sexual, there is certainly implications of some preoccupations with an amorous, which is also coupled with the jealous thought of the speaker. But the speaker is still making an effort to think no ill as a closure to the final couplet. And the couplet ironically brings to life the very suspicions that it's trying to suppress. And, the final couplet is, so true a fool is love that in your will, though you do anything, he thinks no ill. And I think here it's interesting in terms of editing. In all the modern editions, the word will is not capitalized, whereas in the folio edition of the 17th century, it's clearly, Shakespeare's name is there and the W is capitalized. And I've always thought that kind of odd, but certainly Shakespeare comes in here. So finally, through the summation about the folly of the relationship occurs in the third person, and that's also interesting. So the question, where he in the couplet he says, "So true a fool is that in your will, though you do anything, he thinks no ill." So suddenly there's a shift to the third person. So does the slave distance himself from his enslavement? Is he a fool for love, or is it a generalized state to which Shakespeare draws his readers? So this is a kind of my little stab at a close reading of the sonnet in terms of who is speaking, whose voice do we hear, and what is the phenomenology of this experience. And now the second part, the final part of my paper, is just briefly, I want to stress on how this sonnet can lead us to reflection in pedagogy, and importantly, how may we begin to draw out and expand the social meanings of this lyric self in Sonnet 57 by noting the historical resonances of the word slave. Now, in the OED, one of the meanings of the word slave is, quote, "one who is property of and entirely subject to another person, whether by capture, purchase, or birth, a servant completely divested of freedom and personal rights." Now, the OED doesn't give any examples from slaving practices, from the slave trade. However, tellingly, and I think importantly, one example it gives is the word for slave was replaced, how it was used in Shakespeare's The Tempest, which was a play written after the sonnets. So the example given in the OED is from The Tempest, when Caliban says, "We will visit Caliban," Prospero says, "We will visit Caliban, my slave." And as we know in The Tempest, Caliban's servitude is central to the plot, and Caliban is certainly defined and treated like a slave, with punishments, with control, and so forth. So while I think the OED gestures to that meaning of the slave, but when we look at the 16th century slave trade emanating from England, this is a journey others must have taken. And for instance, but interestingly, the word slave was often not used in the narratives of, say, John Hawkins, who was the first slave trader. And this is something that I have written on elsewhere, but it's worth noting and worth exploring for students is how the word slave was used in the actual slave trades. And actually, as Sujata Iyengar and others have written, that interestingly, the word slave was often replaced by quote unquote, and I use the term, with sparingly, was replaced by the term Negro. So finally, I just like to mention an exercise here, which Patricia Kime's brilliant recent article lays out. It's called Cultivating Expertise, Glossing Shakespeare and Race, where she offers a pedagogical glossing exercise. So to end my paper today is that when we read Sonnet 57 through the lens of enslavement practices and a history of the slave trade, we can expand the contextual interconnections between the word slave in a glossary that could include words such as savage, devil, black ram, deformed slave, blackamoor, and I think many others from Shakespeare's plays. We could also discuss Caliban, we could discuss the twins in Comedy of Errors, and kind of expand the student experience due to that. So finally, I just want to say that, I'm just taking this journey, which others have taken in very interesting, brilliant work on the Dark Lady. And I'm interested in exploring more signs of corruption, flaws, dissonances in the English cultures, its class hierarchies, its erotics, its exigencies of desire. And I think some work really good work has been done in queering desire in the sonnets and so forth. And finally, I'll just end. I hope that we can have more conversations between different lyric voices, Shakespeare, Milton, and Fez, and the other poet, Imtiaz Dharkar, that Amrita mentioned. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any comments or questions.